to the Medical College of Wisconsin's Coffee Conversations with Scientists. I'm your host, Raina Andrews, and for those of you tuning in for the first time, let me just introduce yourself. Well, myself. I am a mother, a children's book author, a public health advocate, a TEDx speaker, and an engaged community member. I'm your host for the 2023 Coffee Conversations with Scientists series. Coffee Conversations with Scientists is brought to you by Advancing a Healthier Wisconsin Endowment, which is a statewide nonprofit working to improve health and advance health equity in Wisconsin. Since early in 2021, we have been sharing the science behind today's most important health topics. And today is no exception. Today, I'm really excited because we're exploring the microscopic world within us. We're going to have a conversation on the human microbiome. Micro. Many people say it many different ways, but it is the microbiome that we're discovering today. And I'm joined by our local expert, Dr. Nita Salzman, Professor, Pediatrics and Microbiology and Immunology, Director, Medical Scientist Training Program, and Founding Director for the Center for Microbiome Research at the Medical College of Wisconsin. Welcome, Dr. Salzman.
Thank you, Raina. Thank you for inviting me here today.
Absolutely. So, folks out there in the interwebs, we will be covering a great list of questions on the role bacteria play in our bodies. Yes, for those germaphobes out there, there's good bacteria and it's necessary for our inner workings. We have a lot to cover in a very short coffee break, so I will make sure that the questions that I'm encouraging you to send in the chat on our live stream, we will be sure to get to some of your questions by the end of today's program. So let's get to it, okay? So kicking things off, Dr. Salzman, could you provide a brief overview of what the human microbiome is and why it's so crucial to our overall health?
So the human microbiome refers to the trillions of microorganisms, including bacteria, viruses, fungi, and parasites that live in or on our bodies. Most live in our gut. There's a slide I'd like to show you showing the makeup of the human microbiome. Humans have 30 trillion cells and 20,000 human genes, but our microbiome has 39 trillion microbes and between 2 and 20 million microbial genes. So in total, we're actually more microbial than we are human, with the human genome making only up 1% of the total genetic material in this sort of human microbe ecosystem that we're part of. The microorganisms play a very important role in a variety of functions in our bodies, from digestion to immune response and overall metabolism. And in fact, we talk a lot about the human microbiome, but almost everything in the environment has a microbiome. For example, there's a soil microbiome, and the soil microbiome is part of the terroir that contributes to the taste of wine grapes, for example. And ultimately to the taste of specific wines. Cheese has a microbiota that contributes to cheese ripening and flavor. In fact, the bacterial composition of cheese is a carefully guarded secret in some cheesemakers in Europe, because that's the secret to the flavor of their cheese.
So can you elaborate just on the role that bacteria specifically plays within our bodies and how they form like these little microbiome communities?
So bacteria are the best studied component of the microbiome, and they're sort of key players. They're the ones we understand the most. It's not entirely sure that they're the most populous, because there are probably more viruses and bacteriophage in our microbiome than even bacteria. So in our gut, they can act as this huge metabolic engine. They can ferment non-digestible dietary fiber, and they extract energy from it and nutrients from it, and they provide that energy and the nutrients to us, the host. In addition, the byproducts of bacterial fermentation, so what the bacteria produce, contribute to the development and the function of the immune system. They synthesize vitamins. They're actually also major producers of serotonin, which impacts our brain function. So there is definitely a gut-brain connection. The microorganisms form these complex communities or ecosystems. So you think about sort of the greater ecosystem. Well, this is our internal ecosystem, and they depend on each other for nutrition. So some bacteria depend on the byproducts of other bacteria to survive. So they only grow in these complex communities. They can't grow on their own. And ultimately, they form this consortium that interacts with us, the host, to maintain a balance in our metabolism and our immune system.
So it's clear that bacteria are essential, but are there distinctions between good and bad bacteria? Like, how does this impact our overall well-being?
Okay, so that's actually a really good question. It's not one that has an easy answer, though. Um, there, I don't usually like to think of bacteria as good or bad. There are relatively few truly bad bacteria that almost always cause human disease, and we would call them pathogens or pathogenic bacteria. But pathogenic bacteria aren't pathogenic to all species. So bacteria that can live perfectly okay in, say, a chicken, like salmonella, doesn't make the chicken sick, but if we eat it, we get very sick.
Oh, that's
So
interesting.
it's all about the bacteria communicating with the host and the particular host. In our gut ecosystem, you have a combination, for the most part, of beneficial microbes and also bystanders that just happen to be along for the ride. And they are kept in balance by our immune system. So when in balance, this ecosystem contributes in positive ways to our health. It supports various functions in digestion, immune functions, but when they're imbalanced, it can lead to various health issues, such as infections, digestive problems, obesity, things of that nature. And for the most part, our immune system doesn't see our microbiome as a threat and keeps it in check without causing any disease or inflammation. But when the balance is disrupted, either by problems with our immune system or problems with the bacterial populations, the result is that you can have inflammation. And you can imagine what would happen if our bodies perceived all of this bacteria as a threat. We would, even a small percentage of this bacteria, we would have inflammation all the time because our immune system would always be responding strongly to the presence of this bacteria. And in fact, this is what happens with people who have inflammatory bowel disease. They have an abnormal immune response to their own colonizing bacteria, and that results in chronic inflammation. If you look at it really simplistically, bacteria have a goal to eat and divide. So that their goal is survival. They want to eat, they want to divide, reproduce, and they're neither good nor bad, okay? They are kept in check by our immune system. In the absence of our immune barriers, they'll invade us because they can. You know, they don't have any particular opinion about it. We are food, right? So after someone dies, the barriers break down and bacteria will invade from the gut, which actually is what contributes to body's decomposition after death. So,
So the
like I said,
bacteria,
we're just food.
we're
So
just food for the bacteria,
we're
and
just
just
food
like
for the
you
bacteria.
said,
Yeah.
Dr. Salzman, I want to follow up on a point that you made. You mentioned that when imbalanced, it can
Mm-hmm.
lead to various health issues, and obesity being one of them. And with the obesity crisis that we have in America, how does an imbalance of the bacteria in your body contribute to obesity?
So that's actually an interesting question. I forgot to mention, I have a nice slide for, I don't know if it was put up, about what we're trying to balance here. Our immune system is balancing this enormous bacterial burden.
Mhm,
So the particular contributions to obesity are complicated.
mhm,
Um, if bacteria in your gut is more efficient at extracting nutrients from your food than, say, another person, well, you could eat a meal and extract more nutrients from that meal than somebody with different composition of bacteria in their gut. That is a very simplistic way of looking at it. It has gotten far more sophisticated in terms of bacteria that contribute to or limit obesity. Other people have seen that if you disrupt bacteria, as in reduce the numbers of bacteria in your gut, that bacteria is responsible for using energy and using calories. So it's actually responsible for your metabolic rate, your resting metabolic rate. So in the absence of bacteria, your resting metabolic rate is changed and you can gain weight. This happens with certain medications that people take that are associated with weight gain. It's certainly associated with antibiotic use. In this country, we use low-level antibiotics in agriculture, in some agriculture, because it makes animals grow bigger and fatter,
Oh, like our chickens
faster.
and our cows. Yeah, that meat.
And so we have to assume that if we use antibiotics, they're making us grow bigger and fatter, faster, us being mammals as well.
That's
So
a really good point. And I want to put a pin in that because I want to come back to um, you made a very interesting point how antibiotics can make our animals grow bigger, faster, and in turn, we are what we eat in effect. But it's a very different practice in other parts of the world, let's say Europe, correct?
right. Yes, yeah. I went to a meeting once that talked about what they use in Europe to grow animals faster,
Mhm.
and what they use is artificial sweeteners.
Oh,
So that's actually sort of a concern because we think of artificial sweeteners as a diet aid. But if
right.
they're making agricultural animals grow bigger and fatter, then I assume they're making us grow bigger and fatter as well. And it's through a relatively complicated pathway um, involving sweet taste receptors in the mouth. So it's actually that turns on your insulin signaling and which is a growth hormone. So
This is very interesting. So, how can our lifestyle choices, especially our diet, as we're talking about artificial sweeteners and obesity, now how does our diet influence the composition of our microbiome and in turn impact our immune system?
So it has a lot of influence. Our microbiome is selected by two things. One is our genetics, basically the makeup of our genetic makeup, and the other is our diet. Those are the two major environmental, well, the diet is the major environmental impact on our microbiome. And then medication, antibiotics, all those other things we come across are also environmental factors. But our diet plays a very significant role. So depending on what you feed your microbiome, you are going to have different outcomes. If you feed bacteria that is beneficial, that whose byproducts benefit your immune health, then that will be beneficial. If you feed bacteria whose byproducts are not contributing to immune health, that will be harmful. For instance, fiber, which actually the American diet is very low in fiber, the standard American diet, which we call SAD for short, for standard American diet.
Like
Um,
it should be a complete revamp, and we can go there another day. But
yeah,
you're absolutely right.
but really, bacteria that are beneficial are fermenters. They ferment the fiber in your gut. They produce byproducts that are beneficial to your health and your immune system. So foods like fermented products, high fiber vegetables, beans, seeds, grains can act as fuel for beneficial bacteria in our gut. So adding those foods will actually contribute to overall gut health.
Mm.
Whereas other foods that don't feed those beneficial bacteria, those bacteria will shrink in numbers and their byproducts will be diminished. And so we will lose that helpful protection.
And so when you say helpful protection, like like good bacteria or certain bacteria create a layer of mucus that protects your cells from the bacteria.
Okay, so the bacteria do not produce mucus. Our
Okay.
cells produce mucus, and that's actually a major line of defense. We
Oh.
produce sort of buckets of mucus a day in our gut, maybe gross to think about, but it forms a protective coating over our gut, and
Mhm.
it sort of keeps bacteria away
Mhm.
from the cells.
Mhm.
So if you feed beneficial bacteria, they do not eat through the mucus. So they contribute to stimulating cells to produce mucus. They chew on the mucus a little bit, but they don't destroy it. If you change your diet and you don't feed the bacteria that eat fiber, the bacteria that you can have an increase in bacteria that like to eat the mucus because that's the food that's there, and they can thin that layer between the bacteria and the host, which means the closer bacteria get to the host, the more potential they can have for causing disease.
I've heard that mucus is a breeding ground for disease in the body. Are there different types of mucuses here? Not to get off track because we're talking about bacteria today, but in the context of mucus being a protective barrier, this type of mucus is the good kind in your body.
Well, I think the issue would be overproduction or
Okay.
underproduction of
Mm,
mucus, or like in cases of people with cystic fibrosis, sort of a abnormal salt concentration that makes their mucus not behave the proper way
mhm,
and causes problems.
mhm,
Mucus itself, though, shouldn't really be a problem. I think it's if it's in the wrong place, if there's too much of it or if there's too little of it.
mhm. Just a moment ago, we were talking about lifestyle choices and the impact that our diet has on our microbiome, and which in turn affects our immune system. I'm wondering, many listeners, probably including myself, drink things like kombucha and have a prebiotic or a probiotic. Can you share what effects some of those products have on our microbiome?
So a probiotic is a live bacterial product that is thought to have a beneficial effect. A prebiotic is essentially food that feeds certain kinds of bacteria. So with a probiotic, it's not that they are without beneficial effect because some of them are beneficial. Um, it's just that there's not a lot of research on sort of global effects of probiotics. Any bacteria that you ingest will, for the most part, only last in your system for a day or two. So you have to keep ingesting it. It doesn't actually change your colonization of your gut. The first bacteria that get there set up a system where they take up all available space and binding sites, and they they basically contribute to something called colonization resistance, which means they won't let any other bacteria gain a foothold in your gut. So probiotics could have function while they're there, but they will not stay.
Mm,
And so you constantly have to take them. Prebiotics will feed who's there, so it will change the ratios of bacteria that are fiber fermenters versus bacteria that just eat sugars or things like that. So it will enhance the bacteria that can enhance the bacteria that's beneficial, or it can uh, limit the bacteria that's beneficial.
got it. So I
So prebiotics, you're not taking live bacteria, you're taking food for your bacteria, which is what your diet is. Feed your bugs. You're feeding your bacterial colonies.
mhm, it's that fermentation that
Mhm.
okay. I think it's a good time for us to take a question from our audience. So the first question is, what role does genetics play in the health of an individual's microbiome?
So this is a really interesting question. I can talk about this just based on some of my research into inflammatory bowel disease and Crohn's disease. So Crohn's disease is thought to be basically based on a genetic abnormalities that drive an abnormal immune response to your own bacteria, or I think it's now an abnormal immune response to your own bacteria in a genetically susceptible host. What you have in Crohn's disease is at least 200 different genetic variations that contribute to increased susceptibility for disease. And many of those variations have to do with handling our immune response to bacteria. So people with inflammatory bowel disease tend to have different colonization in their gut because they're unable genetically to respond appropriately to bacteria. So bacterial handling is not is not the genetic forte of individuals with Crohn's disease. So even though you can treat the disease, sometimes it gets better with antibiotics because you clear out some of the big bacteria. Your body is continuously selecting for bacteria that are not beneficial.
Mhm. What's interesting, and what this question is, what role does genetics play in the health of an individual's microbiome? When we were first talking about this, you talked about at birth, bacteria is introduced to your body, whether it's a vaginal birth or a cesarean section. Can you say more about that? Like,
So your the first bacteria that get there usually set up shop, and make it make it harder for the next bacteria to take their space. So if you're born through vaginal delivery, you will be colonized by mom's vaginal microbiota. And, because delivery is not exactly a sterile event, also fecal microbiota. If you're born by cesarean section, the first bacteria there tend to be the maternal skin microbiota.
mm,
Um, and then feeding has a lot to do with it. Babies that get formula, you feed whatever's there, um, somewhat indiscriminately. Babies who get breast milk has nutrition, but it also has interesting products in it, particularly a group of sugars called human milk oligosaccharides. Now, it turns out that the human gut can't digest those products. The only thing that digests those products is one specific bacteria called bifidobacteria. Um, so Bifidobacteria infantis, as a matter of fact, a particular strain. So babies that are breastfed are set up to colonize with this strain of bacteria that's beneficial. So we actually are programmed to be colonized by appropriate bacteria.
wow. So I had no idea that there's this whole world working, this inner working communities within us. Another one of our questions that I was quite curious about is, how does the environment, including factors like pollution or antibiotics, affect our microbiome communities within us?
So both of those things can influence the microbiome. Antibiotics and other medications can disrupt the balance of the microbial communities. Antibiotics for sure will disrupt your microbiome, which will then recover, but it never recovers to exactly where it started. It recovers to close to where it started. So several rounds of antibiotics, um, you'll develop a new normal, okay, which might not be as good as the old normal. Um, the There is some evidence, so this is not an area that I've studied at all, that pollutants like the PFAS or PFAS or whatever you want to call them can alter the microbiome. So the PFAS, which are used to make flame retardants that accumulate in the environment, now I guess, it's a big cause of concern in our water system. They can do things like thin the mucus layer in our gut, which will lead to alterations in our microbiome.
Mhm.
So it's useful to be at least mindful of these things going
And
forward.
to that point, the significance of that is that, la- like shortening or thinning out that mucus layer makes you more susceptible to those bacterial diseases or viruses.
Exactly, to inflammation.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. Other things like we put antimicrobials in a lot of things now.
Soaps.
Well,
Mhm.
antimicrobial soap, which is sort of weird since soap itself is antimicrobial, so it
Mhm.
doesn't really need to put antimicrobials in it. Toothpaste, triclosan, which is in a lot of toothpastes. Their Microban in socks. I mean, we put antimicrobials in a lot of things, and those can accumulate. I mean, there's been evidence that triclosan definitely disrupts the microbiome. Um, so anything that you could ingest, even if not intentionally, the more antimicrobials that are in the environment, the more risk there is for ingesting them. So
Earlier in another question, you mentioned antibiotics and how they can really be good for you and life-saving, but taking them constantly can really hurt the bacteria in your body.
Well, every time you take antibiotics, you're going to be killing off some bacteria. That's what they do. Antibiotics are not all that specific, although, you get broad spectrum antibiotics that kill off a lot of things. You can get more specific ones for specific diseases, but even the specific ones aren't incredibly specific, and will kill off bacteria. Um, and while antibiotics have saved innumerable lives, so I don't want to suggest that you shouldn't take antibiotics when you need them. Obviously, you have to take antibiotics when you need them. But they don't come without collateral damage. And I think for decades, we sort of assumed there was no other effect of the antibiotics. But now there's suggestion that there are effects of the antibiotics. And if we think about the obesity epidemic, for example, there are many different things that are pointed to that have changed in our environment that could lead to obesity. And the microbiome is one of them. So say over the last 50 to 75 years, we've had the introduction of antibiotics. We've had the introduction of artificial sweeteners. We've had the introduction of a lot of different pollutants in our environment, all of which could be having an effect. So we've seen rises in diseases like obesity, but we've also seen increases in type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, inflammatory bowel disease. All of these things have increased over that period of time, and that is too fast for genetics. Our genetics don't change that fast because our human generation time is not that fast. But I think one of the things we've definitely changed is our microbiome.
Mhm.
And the changes in our microbiome have been implicated in all of those diseases.
We'll take just one more question from our audience. The question is it possible to kill off bacteria and replace it with healthier forms?
Not entirely clear.
Mhm. The
Um,
original question, I'm just paraphrasing. The original question is, what about killing off the bacteria there to replace it with healthier forms? So let's say if you have an overgrowth of bad bacteria in your body, is it possible to get rid of it, like take some type of product or get a surgery to get
yeah,
rid of it to introduce a healthier bacteria in your body?
definitely. Okay, so one really good example of that is Clostridium difficile colitis, C. diff colitis,
Okay.
which people get when they've been they've ingested some spores of C. diff. It hangs out in your gut. It doesn't cause you any problems. And then they get a broad spectrum antibiotic for a long period of time. And you kill off a lot of other bacteria, and it allows this bacteria to sporulate and grow. Okay. And then it gives you this sort of bloody colitis, which is very nasty.
Hmm.
So for years, it had been treated with antibiotics. And then you have this problem. You give antibiotics that kills off the C. diff, but it also kills off more bacteria, not just the C. diff. And then it becomes a race. What recovers faster? The pathogen, the C. diff, or your microbiome? So often the C. diff recovers faster, and then you get a recurrence, and you wind up in this endless loop of antibiotic treatment, recurrence, antibiotic treatment. So what they've done now is one of the treatments after you fail the first round or second round of antibiotics is they give you a fecal transplant. And that's basically giving you the whole ecosystem of bacteria from a donor. Um, and it has, with one or two rounds of fecal transplant, it has a 90% plus cure rate for C. diff, because what you've done is you've given somebody the whole community back that then keeps that, what the few bacteria that are left of C. diff, it keeps them in check and prevents them from dividing and causing disease. So it's very effective. It has sort of a high yuck factor, the idea of ingesting um, fecal pellets which are usually frozen, and they can be swallowed or they can be suppositoried or, things like that. It's unappealing, but it actually is very effective.
I'm mind boggled because I'm like, wow. So I didn't know that there's a whole industry for people donating fecal colonies that other people consume to completely reset their microbiome.
Yeah. The people there comes with some challenges. The people who donate obviously have to be tested for every known disease, right? Because you don't want to give somebody this and give them an infection or something. So donors are very carefully screened, I believe. Not that I've, investigated that too far. But one of the things that people are trying to do is make up consortia of bacteria separate from an individual so they know what's in there, and use that to give to individuals, because it could be better controlled of exactly what you're giving somebody, and you could know that there's no potential pathogens in there. Those haven't worked 100% yet, but there are a lot of companies working on that.
Wow. And well, with that, thank you, Dr. Salzman, for shedding light on the really intricate world of the human microbiome. I had no idea, but that is the beauty of coffee conversations with scientists. And now I'm very clear and have a greater understanding on how nurturing our microbial communities are vital for optimal health. We appreciate you so much for taking the time to talk with us about this very important topic.
Well, thank you again for inviting me on.
Absolutely. And for those out there in the interwebs, if you didn't get to your question, please feel free to send us a note at conversations@mcw.edu. I hope you all join us next month for a virtual coffee break and a conversation with the scientists. Have a good one. Bye-bye.